I would, if you were to ask me what voices best define the ethos, the character, the sensibility of Generation X, I would say there's two. One is Bret Easton Ellis, and the other is John Hughes. And in many ways,
The director?
one is a negative of the other.
Uh-huh.
John Hughes, the filmmaker,
Right.
yeah.
So remind us of his key
John
movies.
Hughes, The Breakfast Club,
Right.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Pretty in Pink, 16 Candles. I mean, movies that are just sort of were ubiquitous in the popular culture, and they still are. My daughters watched all these movies.
So you were in what, your early 20s or late teens when they came out?
I was born in 1968. No, I was in high school. These movies were made when I was in high school.
Your teens.
Yeah. I was the audience,
right,
for these films. So if you ask me to sort of say, which voices best capture the sensibility of Generation X, I would say Bret Easton Ellis and John Hughes. Now, they're almost entirely opposite. One is extremely dark, and the other is much more optimistic. And I think that's pretty much gets it right. The '80s, which was the time when Gen X was in high school, was both a time when young people and teenagers had attained the highest level of social capital that people that age had ever acquired. You now had mega stars who were 15 years old, 16 years old. Brooke Shields in her Calvins, Molly Ringwald on the cover of Time magazine. I mean, this was unprecedented. Mm-hmm. Teens had achieved a tremendous amount of social capital, but it was also the time when some really dark youth behavior and youth phenomena began to happen. It's the time when the divorce wave hit really the hardest, and you just had half the youth population essentially with broken homes.
A term that is no longer acceptable, but
I'm old. Have to,
but it was when I was growing up. Yeah.
The older I get, the more I enjoy being able to say I'm old to get myself out of trouble.
Yeah. It gets better and better, believe me.
So I think Ellis does capture a very real element of that generation and that time, but it's only one element of it. It's only one part of it. And also, to be fair to him, it's very specifically about the rich children of the film executives.
Yeah.
That's who it's about. That's where it's set, and it's the world he comes from.
Right. So it has that in common with Play It As It Lays. The cultural context is related.
Right. Now, the connection with Didion. Now, this is interesting. First of all, Ellis cites Didion as his number one influence. And it's easy to see. If you read Play It As It Lays and read Less Than Zero, you'll see the stylistic affinities immediately. For one thing, Didion is a minimalist. She one of the reasons why I think she's such a great stylist is that she's able to communicate a tremendous amount, not just of information, but of emotions and feelings with the least amount of words. It's really astonishing how she does it. And Less Than Zero is written in a similar minimalist style and has a similar effect. He does a lot with very little. And also the deep ambivalence of the protagonist is very similar. And I think that one of the explanations for this, and I talk about this in the essay, is that not just that Ellis had a stylistic affinity for Didion because he liked that mode of writing, but I do think that there is a generational affinity between Ellis and my generation, Generation X, and the generation that Didion comes from, which is, of course, the silent generation.
Because they were your parents, basically.
That's right. They are our parents, right? And Didion actually talks, one of the quotes that I have that's in the essay is from where she talks about the effect that her generation had on her sensibility. And when you read it, she could easily be talking about Generation X. Now, and then a very strong contrast with, on the other hand, the baby boomers and the millennials.
Right. So your theory is... So your theory is, so her generation was called the silent generation. Your theory is silent generation is to Gen X as baby boomers are to millennials. In both cases, the former parented the latter, and as a result, the latter I guess, share their values. Now that's an interesting theory. We definitely don't have time to analyze it exhaustively. I mean, it assumes a certain amount of intergenerational transmission of values, which certainly isn't always the case, because the baby boomers themselves are often depicted in contrast to their. So, like, I'm a baby boomer, and we are the rebellious. Of course, it breaks down right away when you look at baby boomers of different ages. But a lot of baby boomers, influenced by certainly the late 60s, and some of the late 60s was kind of taking shape. Before that, became rebellious, and the rebellion is sometimes cast as a reaction against the values of their parents. Yeah. But in your theory, the values of the parents are in some sense successfully transmitted, at least in the case of baby boomers to millennials and silent generation to Gen Xers.
Yeah, and I wouldn't state it as strongly as you did. In other words, I wouldn't say straightforwardly that there's a transmission of values, because I think that that's probably wrong, and it does fail to take into account the inherently rebellious relationship between children and their parents. I would make a weaker claim, or maybe not weaker, but a less specific claim. I would say that what's transmitted is a kind of an instinctual way of reacting to things or approaching things. That is, it's more the transmission of a modality than a substantial position or view, right? Because look, I mean, the millennials, of course, the form that their various activisms and causes takes, they're very different causes than the ones that the baby boomers did, although there's some overlap. But it's more the ethos, the way of thinking about things.
Right. We can change the world. We can make the world a better place.
That's right. And that problems are always the result. So problems are the result of bad systems, right? And so what we need to do is, if we fix the systems, we'll fix the problems.
Right.
That is, there's an inherent sort of progressivism, if I want to call it that, in both the baby boomers and the millennials. Forward-looking, can do. Everything is fixable. The only obstacles are our will. And bad structures. I
will say, I mean, it's consistent with my experience. I mean, I'm a baby boomer. My daughter is the one who's still in college, very active in prison reform movement, and there's more of that kind of activism on campus now than I think there was 15 years ago.
Oh, way
by a
more.
Long shot.
There hasn't been anything like this since the 60s, right? And look, you can see it even between you and I. What do we spend half our time arguing about? Whether there's meaning, right?
Well, but you don't think there's not meaning. And in fact, interestingly, I think you are in some ways more conservative than I am on some of these fronts. But neither of us is nihilistic, right?
No, I wouldn't call myself nihilistic. And I also don't think Didion is nihilistic. She doesn't think that it's not that she thinks that there are no morals, but what she takes the morality to consist of is a very basic, what she even calls sort of wagon train morality, that's basically just centered around a few core elements of survival. The example that she gives in that essay that I quoted from, I didn't actually quote this example, but she says, here's an example of an actual moral duty. If someone dies, you don't leave his body out to be eaten by coyotes, right? If you ask yourself why, you probably couldn't give a reason. You couldn't come up with a reason. It's just so fundamental to just sort of the hanging together of a social order. The kind of morality that she's suspicious of is precisely the sort that appeals to our conscience, right? And which she thinks is easily manipulated, and she also thinks is too easy to use as an excuse to impose your will on somebody else by pretending that something is an obligation rather than simply that you would like it. She recognizes that the first kind of morality wouldn't be recognized by most as morality, and so she does sort of come off sounding like a nihilist. But I don't think she is. I just think she thinks that what morality actually consists of is something very fundamental, very basic, very primal, and something about which one probably can't say very much by way of giving rationales. And it's precisely the kind of thing that we normally think of as morality that does have all these rationales and justifications that she's suspicious about. And I happen to like that also. I mean, I've written a lot of very skeptical essays about ethics as it is commonly understood. But I do also think of myself as caring about morals and as hopefully being a moral person. But I'm not sure that what I mean by it is quite the same as what a lot of people mean by it, right?